please feel free to come in, and if there's more, like, you can get closer. I don't bite. But thank you all so much for coming to see the exhibits tonight, and thank you for coming to hear me say a few things about my work. I also want to give a special thanks to Cassie and to Tim for being so helpful and communicative throughout the whole process of planning the show and the leading up to it and the installation and the opening, and they've been great. So I wanted to say thanks, and also a special thanks to my husband, Tim, who is here, that helped me install the work. And 2 weeks before the show, I said, oh, I have this idea that I want to have half a picnic table, like, look like it's disappearing into the wall, but I don't know how to fabricate that. And so he helped with that, so it was a pretty big deal. So the British psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott once said, artists are people driven by the tension between the desire to communicate and the desire to hide. And I don't think truer words have ever been spoken about the artist's personality. Because as you probably know, giving an artist talk is kind of nerve-wracking, but there are some things that I would definitely like to share with you all. First, I want to talk about who I make my work for. So I obviously make my work for myself. I make it for my family. I make it for close friends. I make it for all the mentors that I've had along the way of becoming an artist, and some of them are my peers to this day, other artists. I make it for curators such as Tim, who have given me the chance to get my work out of the studio and into the public eye. I make my work for my collectors. A lot of them I know, a lot of them I don't know personally. I make my work for young people so that they might feel vulnerable. I assume they might feel vulnerable in this society, this legacy of a society that we've given them, so that when they have something to look at, so maybe they feel less alone. And I make my work for women, having painted women now for nearly 3 decades. I portray a strong but hopefully vulnerable heroine, because I believe that representations of women can agitate for a cultural shift. And I don't exclude anyone. The thing that makes me most happy is when anyone that sees my work connects with it or wants to talk to me about it or is moved by it. So at its core, my work is personal, and there are autobiographical elements embedded in the work for sure, but it ties hopefully to larger narratives and larger histories, because it would be a shame if it just stopped at my own story. I see painting as a vessel that can hold the insatiable desire and longing that lurks beneath the surface of what we see. Paintings are transmission points from one person to another through the nervous system. And I think they allow the viewer to open up to a vast range of subtlety. I think that one of the most primal and honest relationships that we have in our perceptual world is visual intimacy. And looking at a painting is a very direct experience. And I think that we are lacking that in general, but especially in the last few years. And that's why I think it's so important when you can to see paintings in person. They involve both the brain and the body. So, for example, I'll get an idea that I want to execute a painting a certain way in my mind, but that idea has to go through my hand, has to go through my body. So the body has its own intelligence, and that often morphs the idea. It often changes the idea. So I think painting highlights the connection between the brain and the body, but also the distance between the two. In a nutshell, and I've said this a lot, is that I think painting is a way of setting up problems and then going about solving them. It's a series of decisions and then reactions to that decision, and it's never a straight road. It's usually filled with blind curves and dark alleys sometimes, and U-turns, but that's what I think makes it so magical, is that it's never exactly what you set out and think it's going to go from one point to the next. So when I make a painting, I'm aware that I'm curating a psychological space. And I think paintings like poetry, more like poetry, some like literature, I mean, similar to literature, much like poetry, have the ability to allow you to time travel as a viewer and connect with different characters, objects, and in doing so, to create empathy. So a lifelong question, or since I started painting, so a long time ago, I've had this question, I'll probably have it for the rest of my life, is how do you take pigment, cloth, paper, hairs from a brush and cause an emotion, create emotion, cause reaction in a viewer? And it's a really simple question, but it's also a really profound question. So there's several ways that I attempt to go about doing that, and one way is to try to create a sense of time collapsing or conflating in a painting. So much like dreams and memories, often my paintings have fragments in them or they're fractured. Joan Didion, one of my favorite writers, said, "Memory shifts, memory conforms to what we think we remember." That's why there's really no object more associated with memory than the photograph, because it asks the question, is it the memory or is my memory constructed from the photograph of myself, for example, as a child? Did I form my memory around that photograph? So often I'll slip an unruly element into a very structured scene to cause linearity to collapse or certainty to unravel. I think another way that time collapses, and this is with paintings in general, is that when you stand in front of a painting, you're standing at approximately the same distance that the artist was when they made it. So in my mind, I like to think that there's this forever conversation going on off frame between the viewer and the artist. And it's a special kind of intimacy because it's the same surface that separates the two is what contains it. Another way that I do this, but the fracturing, is through nostalgia. So I've always used nostalgia in my work, maybe not quite as much, but it's still there. It's still all over my work. Nostalgia is tender and it's also sharp. It has the ability to comfort us and to also wound us. There's like this sort of longing sometimes for this perceived innocence of the past when our current reality seems so corrupt. I kind of see nostalgia like, for example, we've all been there when we're like, you hear a screen door slam and it takes you back to maybe your grandparents' house, or you're in your car driving and you hear a song from your 7th grade dance, and all of a sudden you're back in that moment. You remember what you were wearing. You remember the anxiety you felt about going to the dance, and you're like, oh, that's really sweet, but it's also sad because it was a long time ago. And I think nostalgia is like a coercive caregiver. It pulls us in and it says, I'm dying. You're dying. We're all dying. But we are doing this together. The political theorist Frederick Jameson said something, a lot of what he said is a little beyond my comprehension, but one thing he said that has stuck out to me is he talks about the waning of affect having to do with nostalgia. And that is when the subject loses, when we lose the ability to create a progression from past and present, which I think is pretty fascinating. Another way that I infuse nostalgia in the paintings is through artifice and through beauty. So our notions of beauty are tied so deeply to the past. There's a whole nostalgic beauty culture. I also use color. I use clothing. So color, I love black and white work, but I can't imagine not using color. It's so powerful. It creates a mood. It also, there's a lot coded in color. Class is coded in color. Social status, so much. And like, for example, one of the colors I used is like a the color of the year from 2021 or something. So there's all this stuff that's hidden deep within these elements. Also, it allows me to place the subject in between reality and imagination by using artifice. Because some of the things you might see, you're like, oh, they're not in any specific time, but then the way they're dressed, you realize it's contemporary. She's wearing Nike shoes, or she's wearing a certain type of jeans. So all these things allow me to suspend the subject in time and assert identity and assert class. I think there's a way to make a portrait and revere the subject and also critique the subject at the same time. So growing up in the South for pretty much my whole life and living in the South, Virginia, Georgia, West Virginia, I wrestle with memory and the complications of memory and nostalgia and the complexities, but also femininity. And I think that's one of the reasons that I portray young women often in my work, is that that's at that time when social pressures start coming in on women, and probably men too, but I inhabit a woman's body, so that's what I know best. And that's also when the issues of self-worth and self-expression start to hit like a peak, is in adolescence, in that space between adolescence and young adulthood. So I feel like there's so much territory there to mine, and that the passion and the intensity of emotions that is felt at those young ages, I used the word today in the car when we were driving up here, it's an aspirational, it's aspiring. I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by all of us, the aspirations that we have, and I think it's very evident in youth. I also think that women, artists who paint women, possess the ability to situate or to create a transcendent passage full of possibility and full of empathy. And that's why I often place women in this realm between nature and culture. So that's why you might see a woman standing in front of graffiti and then there's a lamb. It's like something bucolic in front of something dystopian. And they're outside of the world of men, which emphasizes their intimacy, their camaraderie, their independence. I think the tensions that arrive in that space are really important. So the paintings in Visionary Picnic revolve around repeating imagery: picnic baskets, graffiti, lambs. And I'm drawn to how I draw upon the connections between Romanticism and consumer culture, because there's a deep tie there with what we're sold and how that's going to make us happy and how we're going to meet the partner that we want. And, all those things are so tied up together, and how we're going to be more lovable and more appealing. So when I started this show, I started with this painting, The Boulevard Is Not That Bad. I posed the models at a picnic scene, sort of based loosely off of Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. My French is terrible, so I'm not going to try to say the French title. But obviously I took the men out of the image. And I think that I want my figures to look like they've adapted to whatever circumstance that they're in, even if what's going on around them is chaotic or volatile, that they have sort of an air of maybe nonchalance or self-worth, that they're not trying to please the viewer. They're not necessarily asking for that, and you can't take their thoughts from them. So what I want to do with the work is to ask the viewer to confront your own interiority. And I think of contemplation, of self-acknowledgement, of confidence, and of solitude in some of the cases. So, and also just the idea of leisure and relaxation, and that no one has to really be doing anything. So I don't want them to be grasped, like I don't necessarily want their feelings to be understood. I want there to be clues, but I want the viewer to insert their own feelings into that. And I think most of all, what I want with the work is sort of a radical declaration of self-acceptance and of self-love. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.